Hi, Andrew from Sachs. This is video number 3 in our 8-video sequence on leadership for resilience and engagement. In this one, we're particularly focusing on where resilience comes from, and we'll start off with nature, which is to say, what are the genetic drivers of resilience? And the next video in the sequence is about nurture and resilience, which are things that we can learn in the course of our life in order to become more resilient. But let's first look at this diagram, which explains nature and nurture. And what we're really saying is that at work, we achieve certain outcomes, and those outcomes can be the quantity and quality of work, and they can also be the quality and quantity of our work relationships, which is to say, a good employee is somebody who gets the work done, but also does it in the context of relating well to the people around them. That's the psychosocial contract that we enter into with staff. We want them to be able not to get the work done alone, but also to be able to relate well to the people around them, be they colleagues or customers or stakeholders or whatever. There are 2 determinants of whether this can be done. One is nature, and that's what this video will relate to. And things that are heavily genetically determined, we see intelligence or cognitive ability. Integrity, I don't like that term, but that's what it's called in the research literature. That's the degree to which a person is likely to do good or bad things. And it's called integrity testing, measures that assess whether people are likely to do those good or bad things. I like to call them counterproductive work behaviour measures, because integrity to me sounds kind of moralistic, but counterproductive work behaviours is really what it's about. Is this person likely to do bad stuff? And then there's the question of personality. Now, why nature? Well, most researchers will say that cognitive ability, intelligence, is, let's say, 70 to 80% genetically determined. Certainly geneticists take that view. And we know that from twin studies, because individuals who are identical twins, who are separated at birth and have never met each other, will tend to have higher correlations in cognitive ability than non-identical twins that grow up in the same family. So enough of this research has been done so that we're able to quantify that. Personality, you'll get more arguments about personality. I mean, some will say as low as 50% genetically determined. Others will say as high as 80% genetically determined. I'm probably somewhere in the middle, about 70 to 75% genetically determined. And we're also not touching on the question of epigenetics, which is to say, a genetic tendency can be triggered by environmental factors. And when we're talking about resilience, we know that irrespective of your genetic makeup, if you have experienced particularly early childhood trauma, although trauma at an older age can contribute to this as well, you're likely to be less resilient. And so there's a genetic component, but there's also an epigenetic component. In any event, if you do the twin studies, you'll get figures of somewhere around, let's say, 70% for personality affecting work outcomes and things like resilience. Now, in the next video, we'll be talking about the nurture effects, which are things like people's skills, their experience, their values and attributes. Now, just to talk about the genetic component to resilience, this is a diagram which is used often to talk about the relationship between positive emotions and genes. And we know that people's levels of positive emotions can go up and down. If you have good experiences in a particular day, you'll be happier. If you have bad experiences, maybe you're going to be less happy or perhaps even depressed if they're severe enough. But what we know is that the person's set point for happiness tends to be heavily genetically determined. And this has been demonstrated in a range of positive psychology studies around the world. So happy people tend to be happy throughout the course of their life. And yeah, they'll have their ups and downs. Sad people will tend to be sad in the course of their lives. Now, one of the things that we know is that when people are dispositionally happy, they also tend to be dispositionally more resilient. Happiness, positive emotions, is kind of a protective factor against bad experiences. And here is Sonia Lubomirski's take on this issue, because this relates to some stuff that we're going to talk about later on, about how people can increase their resilience or how leaders can cause staff to increase their resilience. What Lubomirski said is that the genetic component of this is about 50% of each person. And that's the bit that really tends to be gifted to you. I'd probably say a little higher than 50%, but let's not argue too much. Then there's the stuff that happens to you. And the stuff that happens to you, the environmental factors, she says are really 10%. And the stuff that you make happen, in other words, how you respond to it, is an extremely strong component. And in fact, that is about 40% of our resilience and our levels of well-being and happiness. So just think about that. Life throws us challenges, and the challenges that we are thrown by life can affect us positively or affect us negatively. And if you go back to the ancient Stoic school of thinking from ancient Greece, they believed that it's not what happened to you, it's how you respond to it. And that is dead right. And if you look at modern techniques of therapy, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, it's all about recognizing the triggers for bad emotions and hitting them off or redirecting them so that you're responding more effectively to challenging experiences. Mindfulness is very much about that as well. Being mindful makes you better able to cope with the things that happen in your life. Now, there are strong personality determinants to the degree to which somebody is resilient. And emotional stability is one of those, the ability to regulate responses to emotional events. Some people are naturally more able to respond in a calm way to things than others, and that's what we call emotional stability. That's a big predictor of resilience. The alternative to emotional stability is emotional instability, which is sometimes called neuroticism, and that's negatively related to resilience. And it's also related to a thing called emotion-focused coping versus task-focused coping. Campbell Sills had a famous article on this topic in 2010. Emotion-focused coping is when something happens and we respond emotionally to it. And in work groups, this can become a normalized thing. We're going to tell each other how angry we are or whatever. Task-focused coping is where we say, well, what matters here is not so much the emotions, it's what we actually end up doing, what we end up achieving. And that's called task-focused coping, or a more contemporary term for it is called solution-focused coping. So emotion-focused coping is where we sit down and tell each other how we feel. Task or solution-focused coping is where we sit down and work out solutions and work towards those solutions. Not surprisingly, people who do option B, solution-focused coping, tend to be more resilient than people who undertake emotion-focused coping. And emotions are contagious. So if we sit down and tell each other that we're sad, then the people who hear that are much more likely to become sad as well, which is an ethical issue, isn't it? Because we really shouldn't damage our colleagues by the nature of our communication if we can possibly avoid it. Conscientiousness is also related to resilience. Conscientiousness is the tendency to persist, it's the tendency to be organized, it's a tendency to work hard, and people who have this characteristic tend naturally to be more resilient because they tend to try. They tend to, rather than give up, they will persist, and they may decide I've got to learn something, or I've got to develop a new skill, or I've got to simply keep trying in order to overcome a particular challenge. And finally, there is a relationship between extraversion and resilience, which is to say extroverts tend to be more resilient than introverts. Now, I am statistically an introvert, and we introverts can be a little inclined to fret about things. We also don't tend to socialize our problems. If we've got a challenge, we may think about it personally and we may dwell on it personally. But extroverts might be more likely to say, well, look, I've got this challenge, and maybe their friends will say, oh, we should do this or you should do that. But there is a kind of a strength in numbers, in particularly problem solution. Introverts do tend to be just a little bit less resilient in terms of general challenges than extroverts for this reason. Resilient personality. This is the Hexaco model of personality, otherwise known as the six-factor model of personality. People who are highly resilient tend to be low in emotionality, which has these 4 facets to it: threat sensitivity, anxiety, lack of independence, and overly empathic. And what that says is that if a person is a highly emotional person, they're less likely to be resilient. Conscientious people tend to be highly resilient. And you'll notice that we've got an asterisk against makes decisions carefully. What this means is that a person who has this characteristic is less likely to make their decisions impulsively. And thoughtful decision-making is a component of resilience, as is the tendency to try hard, being committed to hard work, being detail-minded, being organised. Extroverts, particularly extroverts who are cheerful and optimistic, tend to be more resilient than people who are naturally gloomy and pessimistic. Now, cognitive ability can also have an impact on resilience, and the research can be a little confusing because there are some studies that say that resilience is enhanced by cognitive ability, and in general, that's true, particularly if we're talking about work challenges, because work challenges are easier coped with by people who have high cognitive ability, who are smarter. But on the other hand, if you're a very emotional person and you fret about things, Having higher cognitive ability can give you a genius for fretting. You may dwell on something and lie in bed at night thinking up 1,000 ways it can go wrong. And frankly, if you have lower cognitive ability, you won't remember 1,000 ways, well, 1,000's too much, but let's say 7 or 8 ways that things can go wrong. Whereas lower cognitive ability can make people less likely to tune in to a range of catastrophizing ideas. But in general, IQ is an excellent predictor of work performance, so low IQ can suggest higher levels of pressure, and so that can indicate lower resilience. The next video in this sequence is about nurture and resilience. In other words, how can we build people's resilience? Where does the resilience come from, irrespective of people's set genetic points as to how naturally gifted they are in resilience? Whatever the level is, it can be increased. The next video talks about that. Click on the link to join us for that video.